Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining the May 2026 WDMA Town Hall. We're going to get started momentarily, but as usual, we will offer a minute or two to allow folks to get settled into their virtual chairs. So please hold. We'll get started in about 30 seconds. Again, just giving folks time to get settled in. Thank you all for joining us. Okay, we've got a packed lineup of content for everyone today, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you once again for joining the May 2026 WDMA Town Hall. My name is John Crosby, President and CEO of the association, and I want to welcome you today and get started pretty quickly because, like I said, we've got a lot of content to share with you. Our presenters from staff today include Craig Drumheller, our VP of Technical Activities, yours truly, as well as Alex McIntyre, who is Manager of State Policy. Our agenda is going to cut across several areas of interest and concern for the industry, including a deep dive on California's SB 54 EPR law. And then we're going to pivot over to federal policymaking and discuss the details on renewal of the U.S.-Mexico-Canada trade agreement. And then we'll wrap up sort of the heavy content portion of the program with an overview of the I-codes and the development process to date. And then we'll add some value at the end to give you just a quick overview of the work we've been doing on a new industry economic impact study, plus a little bit of an update on the programming that you can expect at the Frame Conference coming up at the end of June. So the first thing we're going to do is a deep dive, as mentioned, on a state issue. In this case, it's extended producer responsibility. And in particular, it is the law in the state of California, which is of major concern to many, many manufacturers in our industry. And you likely are already aware, we have a partnership with government affairs experts at Searle and Haley. We're joined by Greg and Andy from their team to give us an overview of SB 54 and answer any questions you might have. Andy, if you want to take it away, I'll drive the slide deck for you.
Sounds good, John. Thanks. And thanks everybody for tuning in today. I know talking about California sometimes isn't on everybody's bucket list, but we are in an interesting point in time in terms of the overall program in California. Just as a reminder, this is a program that relates to packaging, so not EPR for products specifically, but for packaging. John, if we can go ahead to the next slide. So Senate Bill 54 passed in 2022. It was actually the third state to pass a packaging EPR law. So it was in the tranche of states that were sort of early adopters to the idea that we're going to have producers responsible for the financial and at times management responsibilities for packaging. And so California came in sort of that initial first wave. Maine, Oregon, California, and Colorado, all in the first 2 years became sort of the initial four states to consider packaging EPR and actually pass those ideas into law. And so it was largely as a result of a ballot initiative that a lot of folks forget about that came before and was certified for the ballot for that year. That would have put a consumer-facing fee on packaging, would have some of the same mechanics with regard to source reduction and what's known as the mitigation fund, But it was a different structure. And there were a lot within industry that were getting ready to fight that ballot initiative. And for those that have been through California politics and ballot initiatives, those are multi-million-dollar public affairs campaigns to try to shape public opinion around ballot initiatives. So not a small prospect. And so there was a lot of pressure in that legislative year to come to agreement with the sponsors of this bill, Senator Allen in particular, and the sponsors of the ballot initiative, those organizations that had funded and had their ballot initiatives, the signatures certified, et cetera. So that was the backdrop with which this legislation was negotiated. It not exactly one in which I think a lot of folks would argue there was a whole lot of leverage for industry, knowing that the environmental community, for many regards, was happy to wait and see what happened through the ballot initiative process. So that's why California is different. That's in a lot of laws, California is different, and certainly in this case, California is very different from some of the other states. It does use the idea of the producer responsibility organization. Circular Action Alliance was designated back in 2024 as the producer responsibility organization for the program. It covers a broader swath of packaging materials and food serviceware. And one of the big things is obviously for this sector, coverage or inclusion of a vast majority of the commercial packaging. There is an off ramp and some things that we can get into with more detail, but in general, it covers a broader scope of the universe than, say, Colorado, which focuses much more on the residential recycling system. So, where do we stand now, or just big picture, where do we stand on some of the core fundamental issues? It's a program that is sort of shared responsibility between the Cal Recycle agency and the producer responsibility organization for different functions. Cal Recycle is the one that's responsible for the needs assessment. But it is the only state currently. New York is certainly going to try to challenge that potentially. We'll see what happens at the end of next week. But it's the only state that currently sets some of the most expensive and restrictive requirements in statute. So very specifically, there's this 25% source reduction requirement. There's the mandate that all packaging be recyclable, reusable, or compostable by 2032. And there is specific designation of this mitigation funding, which is going to be paid for by producers in order to, at $5 million or $500 million annually for 10 years to get to $5 billion in the total value of the mitigation fund to address plastics in the environment and plastic contamination. It is essentially what we call the environmentalist slush fund with regard to that portion of this law. So that's how it's very different from other states, and how when folks think about California, they add zeros to what you've been thinking about with regard to other states in terms of cost, in terms of the burden to get towards compliance. So, why we wanted to talk about California a little bit more in depth today was because of the regulations being adopted at the beginning of the month. I think folks probably followed a little bit the fits and starts with regard to the regulatory process that has occurred for the last 18 months plus, and the perspective that we are now beginning to truly get into the operational phase for California is something we wanted to make sure we spend some time to brief you guys on, and make sure that you're ready to begin to fulfill some of the obligations that are required under the law. So, and there are recycling rates that will begin to phase up here as we get closer and closer to some of those deadlines. So I'm going to hand it off to Gregory next for the next slide, and we can jump more into the mechanics of the regulation and what comes next.
Thank you, Andy. Yeah, so on the next slide, we are going to go over what is actually in the regulations that isn't in the statute itself necessarily, as well as some of the more significant fights. So I'll go through these somewhat quickly, but we can talk more at the Q&A portion if you want to. So just the first bullet, regulations give a lot more detail about what will be required for any producer that's seeking one of the exemptions allowed under the law. So you can get an exemption for unique challenges if your material poses unique challenges to the recycling system, or if it poses any health or safety issues. So most likely there's going to be a fair number of applications for the unique challenges exemption, and the regulations, I think they're like 3 pages long about all the different requirements you would need to follow and submit information on in order to pursue that. So definitely a high bar for entry to get that, and lots of detail in the regulations. Next, there is some information about what is required to get a de minimis determination. SB 54 allows an exemption from the law if components of packaging are de minimis as determined by CalRecycle. So the regulations put that provision into effect, and they specify that if something is going to be considered de minimis, it can't pose an issue in the recycling system, it can't be a health and safety issue, things like that. So none of those determinations have been made yet. So as of this current reporting period, and the reporting deadline is a few days away, nothing is considered de minimis. So no one's going to benefit from this provision, at least until next year, unfortunately. Next, there's some detail about how to get your material validated when it uses PCR. Specifically, it has to follow the APR certification standard, unless another standard is approved, but I don't think that's happened. So there's detail about how to use and submit APR certification. Next, you've probably heard, if you're following EPR, about eco-modulation, but just very briefly, that is a way to give bonuses and malices. Otherwise, you can consider them credits or penalties on top of your fees that you pay into the program, for desirable traits or undesirable traits. And in California, desirable traits that can get you credit are use of the APR design guide and meeting it, and having your material be validated under it. A malice would be for use of toxic chemicals, and the regulations interpret that to mean using any chemical that's listed under Prop 65, which, if you're not familiar, could be potentially thousands of chemicals. So that was a pretty broad, sweeping, unfortunately, provision that they enacted. We and others did push back, but we're not successful in narrowing that down. Next, there is some detail about how source reduction needs to be reported. So as Andy talked about on the prior slide, there's a 25% requirement for plastic components, as well as the weight of plastic, to be reduced from 2023 to 2032. So there's a little bit more information about how that will be implemented. Last year, during the rulemaking, there was a provision that allowed that source reduction to account for sales growth. So as businesses grow, the baseline in 2023 could also grow to match sales growth. CalRecycle took another look at that and said, actually, we don't think that's allowed. So as of now, the entire state, the packaging industry, has to source reduce against the number of plastic components and the weight of plastic sold in 2023. So that is a very, I'll say, alarming reality that we're dealing with. No matter what, as the law stands now, we are looking at indefinitely, you have to keep reducing the amount of plastic until you hit that 25% below 2023 level, and it cannot go above that in future years. So something to keep in mind. And then finally, new to EPR in the United States is a concept called responsible end markets, which means that where the recycled material ends up has to meet certain expectations, including environmentally protective, so no emissions, or follows permitting requirements without penalties for emissions, potentially labor standards, other things like that, that various states are setting. and trying to raise the bar of what they want to see recyclers do. So that was a very quick rundown of 160 pages of regulations. I'll also talk about the second half of this slide, some of the more significant debates that played out over the last year or two. The first was over advanced or chemical recycling, so recycling for certain kinds of plastics in particular, especially films. Um, Environmentalists and the sponsors of the bill were pretty adamant that the law did not allow for advanced and chemical recycling, but nowhere in the law does it explicitly ban it. And CalRecycle, to their credit, took a fair interpretation and left the door open for advanced or chemical recycling to be included and allowed in the program. There's some steps it has to meet, including verifying that there's not a significant amount of production of hazardous waste, among other things. But the door is definitely open, which was a positive sign. But the flip side of that is we do expect to see a lawsuit from some of the environmental groups over this provision. So that could be overturned. It hasn't even been filed yet, so we're way early on in this process. The next one, and kind of related, the law has an allowance for exclusions for food and agricultural commodities packaging if it's controlled by federal laws, regulations, or guidelines. So essentially, if it's preempted by federal law, it would be exempted under SB 54. Those same environmental groups that are planning to sue are also planning to sue over this provision. They thought it was left far too broad, which is interesting because some producers don't think it went far enough. So CalRecycle is kind of caught in the middle and can't make anyone happy on some of these provisions, but that did take up a lot of debate this year. And then finally, as I mentioned before, there was a hard push to restore that source reduction baseline adjustment, but CalRecycle dug in and did not restore it. So that is what plastic producers are up against. And then if we go to the next slide, we can talk about what's around the corner for the rest of the law. So as hopefully you're all aware, May 31st is the CAA reporting deadline. And that's not just for your 2025 supply data, but also for the first annual source reduction report, as well as 2023 supply data. Following that, in the middle of next month, CAA is required to submit their draft program plan, which will then be reviewed by the state. We should see a lot more detail about how implementation will happen once this plan is submitted. So I think a lot of attention will be drawn back to California at that date. Another requirement from CAA is that all producers of plastic materials submit a source reduction plan by August 1st. And this is detailing what each producer is planning to do through the various methods of source reduction, whether it's PCR, bulk materials, weight reduction, et cetera. They want to know what producers are thinking to accomplish that. Obviously, it's a heavy lift to get that done by August 1st, but CAA does have guidance on to help producers at least get started and maybe draft a plan by August 1st. So that's available on their portal. And then once supply data is in, that allows CAA to start sending out fees to producers. So we expect the first round of fees to come out this August, followed by the first regular and annual set of fees to come out in January. And then, as I mentioned, we do expect litigation, at least on the environmental side, but we do hear as well that producers are interested in potentially suing over some other provisions. You may be aware that the truth in labeling law, which is a separate but related law, is facing litigation as we speak with a trial coming up. So might see something similar coming in the months ahead. And with that, I think we are on Q&A.
Thanks, Andy. And Greg, we do have a couple of questions or at least requests for clarification. One of our members noted that the deadline for reporting was June 1st, but that really lines up with the May 31st deadline that you just mentioned, correct?
Yeah, so there's a lot of deadlines and some overlap. You're right that that June 1st deadline is a registration requirement.
Mhm.
But the law also says that you must be an approved member of the PRO by January 1st, 2027, or else you're not allowed to sell or distribute your products into California. So that's what we were getting at with the slide. But you're right that there is a separate registration requirement right around the corner.
Got it. Okay, thanks for that clarification. We have another question. And I believe CAA is counting on producers to meet the source reduction targets and is planning to manage that through producer incentives and bonuses and maluses. Do you know what happens to CAA if they don't achieve the overall source reduction targets?
That's a good question. And yes, you're right. CAA has said that their plan for implementing the source reduction requirements is through these bonuses and penalties we talked about. So for as I understand it, and I'm not privy to this because I'm not a producer, but CAA will distribute different amounts of source reduction that they expect from each producer. If you exceed that amount, you'll get a credit. If you don't, you'll be hit with a penalty to try to drive the achievement of source reduction. Unfortunately, we don't know what will happen when and if the targets are not met. And I should say that the targets phase in. So the first target is actually January 1st of next year. I can't remember the number, but I want to say it's 10%. So it's possible that Cal Recycle might do a corrective action plan, which would probably be pretty broadly sweeping if the target's not met. But instead of hitting people with penalties, they can put people on essentially a plan to start coming into compliance. So they may require you to show and report steps over time to show that you're going to meet the targets going forward. Maybe you have to invest more in new technology or more PCR. It's an open question right now, but we can only speculate.
Yep.
I will
One
say
last
that
Oh, sorry.
just quickly, there is an interesting distinction here that the California source reduction targets are averaged across companies. If you think about New York, the bill that they are trying to pass into law will know, about a week from now how close we are to that. That would be individually by producer. So if you as a company do not hit 30% source reduction, you individually would be penalized versus this larger question of how are we going to average across companies and what happens if the entire sort of packaging industry doesn't reach source reduction. So that's a distinction I just wanted to make as you think about the evolution of EPR and California being unique. They may not be unique for long.
Thanks, Andy. One final quick question, or hopefully quick answer. We've got to move. Is it true that penalties will not begin accruing in California until 30 days after notice of violation per 42081A3?
Yes, that is correct.
There you go. That was a great brief answer there, Greg. Appreciate that. Andy and Greg, thank you so much. We appreciate your time as always. And for members, if you have follow-up questions for Andy or Greg, please feel free to channel them to us. We'll be glad to get some answers for you. Okay, we're going to move ahead to the next section, which will be our deep dive on federal policy. And normally our director of GR, Michael Pierce, would be with us. He primarily focuses on federal policy. Unfortunately, he has been in Canada with our friends at Fenestration Canada and is unavailable today. So Alex McIntyre, our state policy guru, who actually has a lot of DC and Hill experience, is going to give you a deep dive into what's to come with the U.S. Mexico-Canada trade agreement. So, Alex, take it away.
All right. Thank you, John. And thanks to everyone for joining today. We're going to do a deep dive into the USMCA trade agreement between US, Canada, and Mexico, which is going to be up for review here on July 1st of 2026. So right here, you kind of see the timeline of the trade agreement. I'm sure a lot of you have followed this over the last 10 years or so, it was an important agreement for our industry. The first agreement was negotiated during the first Trump presidency between 2017 2020. And as part of that agreement, they agreed to review the law on July 1st, again, of 2026 of this year. So all parties, Canada, US, and Mexico, are going to come together on that date, and they have a few options at their disposal on how they're going to handle the trade agreement going forward. So they could just come together on July 1st, decide that they want to extend the agreement as is, with a potential few side amendments there. They could do that. So if they decide to do that, it's going to be renewed through 2042. They could also decide to do a partial renegotiation of the agreement. So they would look for a few targeted changes that they would try to negotiate over the next 2 to 4 years. Or they could decide that there is just too many disagreements between the three countries, and that would set the sunset clock for the agreement to expire in 2036. So if you want to go to the next slide. So a few of the big issues that the countries are going to be negotiating and talking about on July 1st include the rules of origin, which is the content threshold of the products coming into all three countries when they're trading, the dairy supply management issue, as well as tariff rate quotas, and then the dispute resolution process. So Congress's role in all of this right now is more of a advisory role. So the White House comes to them to keep them updated on the renegotiation process, what they're thinking. They advise the committees kind of where things stand. If President Trump decides to extend the agreement, Congress does not have to approve a new trade agreement. If there's kind of any, again, side agreements there, Congress does not have to approve that if they're just tinkering around the edges. However, if the three countries decide to make big changes to the agreement, including changes to U.S. laws and trade laws, then Congress will have to step in and approve those provisions or approve a new agreement altogether. So you can kind of see just the timeline here and kind of where things sit with Congress. And so they're always going to be involved in the process. However, they're not going to have a role in approving any new agreement unless major changes are made to that agreement. You can go to the next slide. So here are kind of the three main priorities that the U.S. has, and specifically with Canada. So the first is the dairy supply management issue. So the U.S. is concerned that Canada is protecting its dairy industry too much, and they would like to see the access barriers reduced with Canada in terms of U.S. dairy producers having access to Canadian trade there. And then the big one for us, and I'm sure all of you have been tracking this for years, is softwood lumber. So there's concern, again, Canada owns a lot of their forests. They charge low fees to Canadian companies to cut the forests, and there's concerns about that wood coming into the U.S. So President Trump has put duties on that wood that has been coming into the U.S. for the last really 10 years. So the current rate is 35% duty on those softwood lumber. Canada obviously does not like that. So there has been a dispute ongoing between the two countries for years now. It remains to be seen whether they will try to handle this dispute within these renegotiations and how that will be handled. Again, this is a big priority for us, and so we're going to be tracking this part of it closely. Obviously, we think this is this issue, getting this resolved, is important for home building and construction in the U.S. And so we're going to be having a keen eye on that. And then probably the biggest area of concern and dispute between these countries is the rules of origin. And so President Trump is concerned that other countries like China are foregoing the trade agreement by sending inputs into Canada and Mexico, and then they're able to get around that the tariff rate quotas by using those two countries to get into the U.S. market there. And so we think the rules of origin is going to see the biggest changes, and that is where Congress might have to step in and approve a new part of that agreement there. And so we'll see what happens. That part impacts a lot of different products, automobiles, batteries, steel, aluminum. So we'll be tracking that as well. If you can go to the next slide. So these are kind of the three scenarios that we could see play out here in the coming years in terms of a renegotiation of this agreement. So again, there could just be a pretty simple extension where they agree to extend the agreement to 2042 for 16 years. Again, they would just make side amendments to the agreement. You can see a few of the issues there that they could potentially touch. We also going to have a protracted standoff. So they don't agree on July 1st to extend, and they agree to negotiate a few of these bigger issues, make changes. And then the third scenario is a major renegotiation of the agreement. And so, again, this could take a long time. It could be 2 to 4 years. It could extend into the next presidency in 2029. So that could be an interesting complication if that happens. Given what we've heard from President Trump and his trade office, we think that scenario B and C are probably the most likely scenarios currently. They said they've wanted to make a lot of changes to the agreement. Jameson Greer, who's the U.S. trade rep, has said they want to tackle a lot of these big disagreements in the renegotiation process. So I would expect that July 1st approval date is probably not going to happen, and they'll go into some sort of renegotiation process with that scenario B or scenario C. So that's kind of where things stand right now. Again, as John said, our Director of Government Affairs, Michael Pierce, he's the expert on this issue and has been tracking it closely. We can take any questions here, or you can follow up with him too after the webinar.
Thanks, Alex. Any questions? Feel free to pop them in. We're going to keep rolling and we can follow up. There's none at present, but Alex, thank you so much for taking us through that. We are going to move to our next segment. Most of you, if not all of you, are probably generally familiar with the ICC acronym, International Code Council. As most of you may very well know, we're very actively involved in representing the industry and advocating for its interests with respect to the development of construction codes. And here to give us a deep dive into an overview of the codes themselves, but then also what's been happening of late, is Craig Drumheller, who is our Vice President of Technical Activities. Craig?
Thank you, John. We're gonna get our mutes taken care of.
There we go.
Okay, I think we're in business now. So thank you, John, and thank you everybody for attending. What I want to do is kind of start at the 36,000 foot level and work my way down. So hopefully everybody will gain something at some level of how the building codes are developed here in the United States and adopted, and some of the changes that we are hoping will be finalized here in the next few days. So first and foremost, the United States does not have a national building code. The International Code Council develops a series of 15 codes, the I codes, we call them the international codes. We call them the I codes. Each state or jurisdictions are the ones that really decide what gets adopted, when it gets adopted. The I codes are published by ICC, and a lot of states, when they adopt them, they're actually modifying them. So they go through a process. Many do it every 6 years, some do it every 3 years, and some do it periodically based on the political winds. And they make up not only updates but modifications based on if you're a flood prone area, they might want to change things, what they call like the freeboard level above the 100-year flood level. Or if they are more concerned about energy, they might make modifications to the energy code. So there's a lot that goes on from the model code that's developed by the International Code Council and what ultimately gets adopted at the state level or local level. There's some states, as you're probably familiar with, Colorado has a lot of, they have what they're called a home rule state. So you're not adopting any state codes. Each jurisdiction is adopting their own codes. Some do a deeper dive into making modifications, like Denver and Boulder and some other jurisdictions in Colorado, where they usually take it to a higher level as far as the performance or the compliance requirements. The codes are developed over a 3-year cycle. Currently, the latest published is 2024, the 2027. I'll go through the schedule, and that will be later this year when that will be published. And WDMA, myself, and Cesar Luan are actively involved in various parts of the code development process. We're at the table at all the hearings. We're at the table. I'm a member of the IECC residential standards committee. I'm one of 36 people that are on that committee that make the final determination on what ultimately gets into the next edition of the code. So here's just kind of a highlight of what all the different code books are. The most important or the most prevalent ones are the International Building Code, which applies to commercial buildings and mid and high rise residential buildings. And then I'll go over to the IRC, the International Residential Code. So that's 1 and 2 family dwellings, and also townhomes. So it doesn't matter how many units are in a townhome, it still would fall under the International Residential Code as long as it's 3 stories or fewer. Then we got the Existing Building Code, which obviously is dealing with buildings once they're built and modified, and the Wildland Urban Interface, the ones that I have marked in red, and the IECC are the ones that are, not that we ignore the rest of them, but those are the ones that we tend to pay more attention to. Occasionally, the mechanical code might have a ventilation requirement that would say, windows would suffice there, and make sure that those provisions stay in there. Fire code, there might be some specific things related to fire codes that we want to stay actively paying attention to. And the Green Construction Code, which is actually the technical requirements are done by ASHRAE, and then the International Code Council basically packages that up. They put administrative provisions in there and then publish it under the IGCC label. And then there's the IECC. So there's 2 different processes. I don't want to dive too deep into this, but there's a governmental consensus process, which we have code hearings, and then there's public comment hearings, and it goes through a process. And that's the governmental consensus process for the 14 codes that are on the top. And then the IECC, since there was a snafu, we'll say back in 2019 on the way that the process was being developed, and some, we'll say, hijacking of the performance of some of the code provisions that were being proposed, it was changed into a committee development process. And as I indicated, there's a residential committee and there's a commercial committee, and I am the WDMA representative that's on the commercial. Or the residential. So now for the 2027 I-Code development process, and this is the first one that I was talking about, the governmental consensus process. It's split into 2 groups. So Group A there's two committee hearings in the first year of the process, or in this case, it was 2024, and that would be the International Building Code, the egress and fire safety, and the fuel gas code, and the plumbing code, et cetera. So those were all heard in Group A. That really isn't the one that's heaviest as far as our interests go, but we did have, I believe, about 8 or 10 positions on those. And then Group B is the 2025. That's more heavily on the residential for the IRC, and the admin part of the IGC and the existing building code. We had a number, probably on the order of 20 some odd proposals that we had positions on. And so again, we went through the whole process here where the proposals, just kind of the general ideas. In January, the proposals are due. There's the committee hearings are in April, which are the ones that just happened a little bit, roughly a month ago, and then there's a second committee action hearing in the October timeframe, and then you have to submit public comments, and then we just had the public comment hearing, so we're just ending on that under 2026. We're just approaching the what they call the OGCV, the online governmental consensus vote, which is the final determination. So we got some key things overturned at the public comment hearing, but they're not final until they're final. And so the online governmental consensus vote will be the final determination of the positions of proposals that are still active. And then that gets validated in the middle of this month. I'm on the ICC validation committee, so we'll be overlooking whether or not people were properly validated to be voters, and if anything looked suspicious or anything of that nature. I was on that about 6 years ago, where there were a lot of concerns, and actually that's part of the reason why the IECC is now a committee process rather than part of the governmental consensus process. So the finalization we expect to be in the June-July timeframe, most likely in July, setting up for a fall publication of the 2027 I-codes. So now for the IECC, which again is the committee process, starting in the first year in 2024, the committee members were appointed in November. The proposals were due in December. And so it just goes through a process of being reviewed by the committee, public comment opportunities, again, reviewed by the committee. And now we're just finalizing in the 2026 category here, that the public comments were posted in January. We're doing final reviews they call them the work groups, and then the full committee will do what they call a resolutions meeting. There's not very many outstanding proposals, so we pretty much know what's going to end up being in the IECC this year. July, the final ballot results will be posted, again, with an expectation of a fall publication. So all of the 2027 I-codes will be available. Usually it's in the October, November timeframe, but they're committing to before the end of the year. So and everything's on track. So I don't anticipate there being any problems. The only thing that's been a problem before are appeals. So if there's an appeal, there's a potential to push it into the following year. But based on anything could happen, but I'm not seeing a big groundswell of issues. And I would expect that we would see full publication of all the codes by fall of this year. So what are the key proposals for 2027? So the ones that went through the governmental consensus process that are important to the window and door industry, the WOCD, the window opening control devices, we were able to get a clear definition in the IRC and the IEBC. There was not a high level of confidence that builders and code officials were checking for not knowing what they are, right? So there was no definition. What does a WOCD do? And rather than just pointing to a reference standard, it's like, what are the key components? It's got to stop at 4 inches. It's got a release that allows the window to open fully for an emergency escape and rescue opening, and then close and reset. So it has to stop again at 4 inches. It was to open up again. So that's clearly defined. So we believe it's going to be in both the IRC and the IEBC. The IEBC is still tentative based on the final online governmental consensus vote that I spoke of. Limited water. So in NAFs, we have the LW rating. Nowhere did it say exactly what an LW rating was, other than going into NAFs. And my guess is not many people are buying NAFs to figure out what an LW rating is. So now this is something that'll be in the IRC and the IBC. And from the perspective of designers, they would know how to properly utilize an LW, and you might want to have an overhang, or it might not be a big deal if you're in a milder climate, or a lower wind design climate, rather than having to worry about potential water leakage, or there's just, and I think it's going to help relieve some potential liability on the manufacturers and the designer perspective. So, and then there was a proposal that we were opposed to. The first two that I just mentioned, we were in strong support of, and we were able to get those through. The other was this forced entry resistance, which we were opposed to because it was very prescriptive. It wasn't performance-based. NAFS has forced entry resistance requirements. And so it's in an appendix. So I don't think it's really that big of a problem the first go around. So some jurisdictions would have to explicitly adopt that appendix. So I think it will give us a chance, if it ends up passing, to go through and refine it and make it more, I think, accurate, as far as, I mean, we talk about it. It's a false sense of security, because we don't think it accurately provides forced entry resistance, and it needs to be modified. So on the IECC side, for energy on the residential, there were some changes to the U factor requirements in the residential, and as well as the SHGC, some minor changes. I don't think a real big deal in 0 and 1 to go from 0.5 to 0.45. Zone 2, 0.4 to 0.35, not a big deal. Zones 5 and 6, when you're going from 0.28 to 0.27, that can really start to eliminate some products, right? Some wood frame windows, or potentially even fiberglass frame windows might have a higher degree of difficulty to get to that 0.27 level. And if you're building new construction, you can kind of compensate for it by doing a performance path. But when you're doing replacement windows, that 0.27 is really a hard and fast numbers in climate zones 5, 6, and also it already applies in 7 and 8. But if you have an idea where 5 is through the Midwest, we'll say Iowa, Indiana, Ohio, kind of those points north would be climate zones 5, and then 6 is north of that. So and then in the Gulf regions and up through the Carolinas, kind of going across the country, is climate zones 1, 2, and 3, and going from 0.25 to 0.23 solar heat gain. So a little bit of a increase in the solar heat gain requirements, but so might have to make some minor changes in designs to compensate for that. The preparation for the 2030. So this is, once everything gets published, it's as we would say, it's time to make the donuts again, right? So we just go through the whole process every 3 years. And in energy, and this is something else that might not be widely known at this point. So the International Code Council has created a new IECCX. They might change the name of that, but they are determined that they're going to create this new higher level energy code, right? So the IECC will be the base IECC, but then they want this potentially higher level version of the code. And the way that they've explained it is that's going to be just basically like a above code program, but it's still going to be a potentially adoptable base code that will take some of these advanced energy requirements that are already in the IECC, extract them out of there, things that had to do with decarbonization, that had to do with on-site and more importantly, off-site electric generation. And that's all going to be extracted out and put into this IECCX. The change they've also put in hard cost effectiveness requirements, which were really kind of a little loose before, just to have 10 or 12-year paybacks, simple paybacks. And pretty much from my perspective, and I've done a lot of this over the last 15, 20 years, that the cost effectiveness levels that they're talking about are already exceeded. So that might really stifle any changes to the energy code going forward. And yeah, like I said, it would hold some of the prescriptive requirements going forward. And this is my take on how we should approach this, is to make sure that 0.27 doesn't go to a 0.26 because of the implications there. Update some of the fenestration text. There's some revisions that need to be made there. The IRC, one of the changes that went through, or we're hoping are going to get finalized, is printed versus published instructions. So for the installation of a window door, a skylight, the installation instructions are kind of need to be customized based on what kind of window and what kind of wall it's going into and what climate zone it's in and what kind of anchoring is necessary. And to do it right, you would need potentially, for all these scenarios, 100 plus pages of installation instructions, and to do that for every single window, door, skylight. And that's the way it's written in the code right now. And so I think we need to, since a change was made to do this for equipment, which doesn't apply to the windows. Now I think we can windows, doors, and skylights. So we need to work on that to see if we can get that changed. As I'd mentioned before, the forced entry appendix, hopefully we can make some modifications to make that more palatable. And WDMA staff, myself and Caesar, will work with the Exterior Products Codes Committee to develop these proposals. And anybody that's on the call, or anybody that with your organizations that wants to participate, please let me know, and we'll get you included in the EPCC, and be more than happy to consider your suggested changes. Any questions?
Any questions? Concerns? Okay. It's here on the East Coast, it's 2:53, so 7 minutes left. We're going to take a few minutes to very quickly provide you with some updates on a few activities of interest or note. For starters, many of you may be aware that the Board of Directors authorized an investment in the study of our industry's economic impact on the American economy, on local communities, and to demonstrate that the reach and the force that this industry has in helping America grow. And there's a purpose behind this, which is essentially to strengthen our ability to communicate effectively with legislators and regulators, because we are very often asked the question, especially from members of Congress, just how many facilities do you have in my state? Or, how many people are employed by your company in my district? These are questions that WDMA staff has never truly been able to answer. It's pure guesswork. This economic impact study is meant to close that gap, fill the donut hole, so to speak, in our story. I'm sharing with you on screen just a brief overview that our partner on this study, Oxford Economics, one of the most reputable economic research and advisory firms in the world, they are the ones conducting this work, and we are pleased and proud to be working with them. They've been amazing in terms of keeping us focused and organized, and honestly taking a lot of the pressure off us as staff because this is not something we do on a daily basis. Right now, or you can say that we've completed more or less phase one, which was an analysis of publicly available data, and then not just doing analysis, but actually using that data to develop a statistical model that covers the entirety of the industry. We've completed that process. A survey instrument has been in the field with member companies now for a couple of weeks. We know that there are a handful of companies that are still interested in completing that survey, and we're working through the process of ensuring that that takes place. I want to emphasize something with that was a concern expressed by some member companies about data privacy. First of all, just to provide crystal clarity, WDMA has documented rules on data collection and use. We do not collect sensitive data like this ourselves. We have, from the beginning, when we began our market study, always relied on a third party that collects that data, houses it for a defined period of time for the analysis process, and then disposes of that data. In the specific case of Oxford Economics, they actually take that to another level because they know when they work with a client like WDMA, there's really sensitive information being shared by member companies. And so they have even stronger data protection policies in place. The analysis that we're waiting on should be completed by the end of this summer, will be inclusive of any of the data that's collected by member companies in an anonymized and aggregated fashion. That means no member company's information will be exposed. It is all going to be collectively analyzed and reported based on the full industry as opposed to any single company. The only way you'll see breakouts will be if it's by state. One of the things that has come up during the data collection process, a handful of member companies have requested an opportunity to secure a non-disclosure agreement directly from Oxford Economics. OE has very kindly agreed to that and has secured NDAs with a handful of member companies. If your company has chosen not to participate, but based on this might actually consider it, please contact me directly, jcrosby@wdma.com. If you are interested in securing an NDA from Oxford so that you can participate, we'll gladly facilitate that process. Okay, going to move on to the final portion of the programming, just to wrap up the afternoon, and we have a couple of minutes. Craig, you want to just tell a quick story about the frame,
Just so everyone
has full information before they click register?
Yeah, right. Yeah, thanks, John. Yeah, we're really excited about the Frame conference. It's going to be in Minneapolis on July 1st and 2nd, following our committee meetings on June 30th. We've got we're rebranding it as the Frame Conference. It was really our technical and manufacturing conference previous to that. But we're starting off with our keynote speaker, Dave Christian, gold medal winner, the 1980 U.S. Olympic team, the leading assist player on the team. So he's going to be talking about leadership, teamwork, and how accountability can transform potential into results. So we're excited about that to kick it off. George Bandy from Anderson will explore how window and door industry can use sustainability as a strategic growth driver. Then we're going to have Varden Mehta, an AI utilization expert. We'll look at how AI can help fenestration manufacturers better understand the market and guide product development, marketing, and sales. Grant Farnsworth from the Farnsworth Group, we have our annual study with them, and this will be our first look at the 2025 shipment data prior to the release of the 2026 report, and talk about economic conditions and growth opportunities with the economy. And then we have Rob Tennant. Again, he's an annual presenter and very popular sessions that he's had, and he's going to talk, about the DOE research, the cutting edge advancements in technologies. Going to focus on the vacuum insulated glazing, and then. And not last or least, Dr. Sinha from the University of Minnesota will share some strategies on building resilient supply chains that can weather global disruption, shifting trade policies, which seems very pertinent to today's environment. And then in addition to that, we've got so we'll have a total of 13 sessions and on a variety of topics, but we want to be sure that everybody has a chance to register, WDMA.com, and go to events, and it's we're looking not only just to the sessions themselves, but we're going to have some networking opportunities. We're going to have a rooftop event for additional networking. So we're really looking forward to that.
Awesome. Craig, sorry
You're
about
both
that.
muted.
Thanks, Craig. That concludes today's town hall. We really appreciate you all sticking with us to the top of the hour. If you have any follow-up questions, member support at WDMA.com, probably the best way to get us a question. We'll be glad to answer anything that comes out of your thoughts from this 1 hour with us. We hope you have a great afternoon, and we look forward to seeing most or many of you at the Frame Conference next month. Thanks for joining us.